I want to pick up on both of the threads that the discussion group went over in terms of understanding essentially how different families can fit under a broader continuum of family relationships and engagement with one another. And then secondarily, we'll get at the different continuums of family communication. So I really like the way that the discussion group brought up the challenges in terms of history and context in defining and explaining what family is, right? When we look at a lot of political and social debate that brings up or discusses the word family, there's oftentimes a lot of particular connotations as to what family might mean, right? One thing that's important to recognize is that especially when we think about different cultures that have existed, of course, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, the definition of what a family is has always been in flux, right? So for instance, there are a lot of kind of indigenous views of family that tend to be larger and more holistic, right? Where family is more than just parents, but it might be a larger tribe or group, and it might be reinforced through things like labels, activities, coming of age, even the passage of myths and stories, right? Similarly, we know that there, of course, have been many challenges in individuals who might or might not connect with the people that might be biological parents. And we know that over the course of families over time, that there have been a lot of shifts in the way that we can talk about what a family is. A term that's become a lot more popular in recent decades is the idea of a chosen family, that family is not necessarily tied by blood or tied by adoption, but that family is composed of people that deeply care about and are really connected to each other. In my morning class, I had a student bring up the idea that for them, right, many of their roommates are members of their family. And when I was in college, and I would imagine maybe some of you have had a similar experience, where rather than traveling for a holiday, maybe for last week, rather than traveling, you might have had a time in where you did a kind of informal holiday celebration with some of your roommates or close friends. So there's a lot of different ways that we can think about what family is. A lot of the way that family is talked about in the United States might date back to the 1950s when this idea of a nuclear family was really popular, right? A married couple that was heterosexual and had 2 kids, a white picket fence and so on, right, was this kind of image of family that was evident in one kind of predominant culture, but of course, even at the time, was not the one-size-fits-all way of thinking about family. It's changed a lot. When we're thinking about some of the contemporary, like social and political topics that are challenging, for instance, there's been a lot of discussion about school curriculum, right? A lot of the arguments that are brought up are in the context of family. What level of autonomy should parents have in determining student curriculum? What does it mean for family and family values or beliefs to be connected, and so on, right? So what we see is there's a lot of tension in creating a sort of universal definition of what family means to people, or what particular values or beliefs are tied to family, right? When the term family values is used, it's a challenging term because the values and beliefs among different families could look really different. So in terms of defining family, right, I think the group did a great job of defining and explaining some of these key ideas. A couple things I want to hit on, right? Some of the ways that we might think about family is that they're tied, maybe through things like marriage or adoption, but again, things like choice and autonomy and who's a member of a family is a big deal. Families don't necessarily have to live together, right? In fact, for many of you who are in your first year here at DOU, this might be your first time away from family for an extended period of time. So you still have family members who are not necessarily in the same physical space. Family roles, the idea that as members of a group, people can take on different roles and responsibilities. It's a key idea. Again, there have been a lot of ways that gender dynamics have changed, or that the different roles that are assigned to members of the family might change too. One thing that's really interesting is the way that many kind of heterosexual or heteronormative roles are written onto or assigned in the context of same-sex couples. So one kind of trope or stereotype we hear a lot, right, as a same-sex couple, and there's a question of, well, who is the mother or who is the father, right, which is in many ways projecting a heteronormative perspective of family onto a family that doesn't necessarily define gender roles in that way. So even within kind of LGBTQ plus families, we see that oftentimes society is imposing or suggesting norms. Common culture. So in my earlier class, I had the discussion leaders brought up a video from Modern Family, right? If you've seen that show, it's an example of a lot of kind of very different cultural backgrounds among family members, but also a lot of bouncing off and sharing, developing the sort of relationship among people in that group. Economic cooperation plays a big role too. There might be ways that there's independence in terms of the like financial accounts that people do, but also some sense of shared work. Families might or may not have children, and then creating boundaries and dealing with the sort of tension between independence and interdependence is a key idea, and that there's some level of mutual affection or care. So remember, if you think back to uncertainty reduction theory, one of the key ideas is that as relationships develop and we're closer and closer to people in our lives, it's more and more okay for relationships to feel a little bit lopsided sometimes. That is, you know, maybe one person's sharing a lot, and another family member isn't sharing quite as much information. It's going a little bit back and forth. So, you know, over time, these family relationships can change. Sometimes, right, you have fights, you're not on speaking terms, but there's the idea that you're able to move back toward a more positive relationship longer term. I think the discussion group did some really great examples here of the continuum, so I'm not going to go over this continuum again in a whole lot of detail, only to say that there's a lot of examples in media we might think about that show these different continuums in place. If you're looking at in your conversation for your final essay, conversation with a family member, you might think about which continuum best describes your relationship, right? So if you've ever seen a show such as Schitt's Creek, which is one of my favorite TV shows, right? The premise of the show is that it's a rich family that's very laissez-faire, that the family members are off doing their own thing, they don't really communicate or relate to each other, right? But the premise of the show is that they have to get to know each other and basically feel like a family again when they have to move into this small town because they lost money. Arrested Development, if you've seen it, is a show that has a similar type of premise. Again, a protective family doesn't really talk about hard topics. The idea that we don't talk about this is oftentimes present in a protective family. So for LGBTQ folks in particular, a protective family can be challenging because it can be hard to bring up or talk about topics like that if it's something that family members consider more of a taboo issue. A pluralistic family, right? Pluralism is the idea that there's this open, democratic exchange. People are very honest and upfront with each other. And then a consensual perspective is the idea that there is hierarchy, there is leadership, there is the idea that, you know, at some level, like, a child needs to be respectful to an elder, but there's still an opportunity for some open communication and engagement to happen within that family. So these are different ways of thinking about our family relationships. And again, I think the discussion group did a great job of talking through some of these examples. I also think they did a great job of going over the idea of family systems theory. And again, dealing with some of these characteristics, how interdependent or connected is the family, how much wholeness or overall cohesion does the family have, the patterns, the regularities, the things that somebody does on a normal basis, interactive complexity. We notice this in friendships and romantic relationships too. How many different relationships or interactions could you have with that person? Complexity is a key idea. How deep or how kind of toward the center of social penetration theory can you reach with that person? And then lastly, this idea of equifinality, that despite some of the challenges in relationships, that there's this openness and ability for the relationship to evolve and change over time. You might think about this as kind of similar to flexibility. So I like to think about family systems theory, right, as a bunch of different gears and cogs turning. A lot of times, if you've seen a show or film that involves like a family, a lot of times we tune in every week because there's a lot of details and specifics that we know about the family members that add to the comedy or what's interesting about that show. So I wanted to point to a couple different examples. I don't know if you've seen either the ABC show Fresh Off the Boat or the Netflix to Pop TV show One Day at a Time. But these are two different examples of how media has depicted families and some of the ways that family members choose to communicate with each other. Right? We see a lot of different examples of family communication in media. And I think using these examples, it's really interesting for us to think about this kind of family systems theory, as well as some of the challenges with disclosure, discussion, and so on among different families too. So as you're watching, pay attention to how family members are communicating with one another and the ways that it might connect to culture. Go up. That's interesting. So the volume is maxed out, but it seems to be as far as it's going to go for today, which is fine. So I'll post some of these after class, just as some examples of ways of thinking about family communication, since the audio is not showing them very well. But these two examples, in the first one, right, it's a family that's moving to the United States and working at this steakhouse, right, and the characters on the show are really adjusting to a very different culture and climate, right? So you have the parents who might really like integration in society, but some of the kids are having challenges. Like there's a scene here where one of the kids is bringing a traditional dish to school, and there's a couple kids that are making fun of him and saying, "Oh, look, you brought worms for lunch," right? So there's some cultural challenges in how family members are dealing with some of these issues and choosing to share or not share with family members. One Day at a Time is really interesting because there's a grandmother, a mother, and then a daughter. And through these three generations, we see a lot of differences in cultural tradition and change over time. For instance, the mother in the show is a veteran and is talking about her experiences coming back. And also, right, the daughter is dealing with trying to go to college and figuring out where to go next in life. So, a lot of these kinds of shows get at the ways that family is communicated and talked about and some of the tensions that can come up in terms of generational conflict, culture, and so on, right? One kind of unique relationship that comes up a lot are children who might learn English as a first language with parents or other family members for whom English is not the first language. There's a lot of ways that culture can be felt or understood differently. Or, as I mentioned, a lot of the indigenous populations in the area of Eastern Oregon and Washington, right, have tried to do a lot of kind of language integration or education programs to help children learn the native languages that might otherwise be lost. So there's a lot of ways that language plays into generational concerns about communication. It's also the idea of a genogram, right? So again, as I mentioned a couple times before in class, the parents were both therapists and warned me that triangles, groups of three, were really bad because oftentimes in family situations, there are situations where two people will gang up against or isolate the third person. That's not always the case, but there can be situations like that where two people have a close relationship and the third person feels kind of on the outside. So there's a lot of ways to ameliorate those concerns dealing with larger groups of people by ensuring that everybody has the opportunity to participate, to be heard, and that it doesn't feel like an us versus them form of communication within families or groups. So the last kind of major activity that I wanted us to do today is in looking at the ideas that we've brought up, I want you to write or type on your own What does family mean to you? How might you define family in terms of your own social relationships? And then I'd like you to pick a couple characteristics of family systems theory and apply them to your own life. So you might talk about interdependence and openness, or something like that. So I'll give you a few minutes to work on this, and then after that, pass that forward. And we'll wrap up for the day in just a few minutes.